The first thing I heard was not an alarm. It was silence. The kind that falls over a bridge crew when something appears on sensors that the sensors were never designed to see. Something so large and so close, and so impossibly quiet, that the instruments take a full 3 seconds to agree with each other about what they are reading. 3 seconds is a long time on a warship. 3 seconds is long enough for every person in that room to look at the same number on the same screen and feel the same cold thing move through them. 2.4 kilometers. That was the length of it. I know because I was the one who read the measurement out loud. My name is Yara Osei, and I am the Senior Communications Officer aboard the GES Unconquered Sun, and I have been doing this job for 11 years, and I have never in those 11 years read a number out loud in quite that voice. The voice of someone who has just understood something very large, very fast. The ship had dropped out of fold space 11 minutes before my shift began. I came onto the bridge still pulling my left sleeve straight, still carrying the half-drunk coffee that Chief Engineer Priya Subramaniam had shoved into my hand in the corridor, with a look that said something important was happening, and I needed to be sharp for it. The bridge smelled like recycled air, and the faint electrical burn that always lingered after a fold transit, like the ship itself was still settling back into normal space, reminding itself of its own edges. Captain Adeze Nwosu was already in her chair. She was always already in her chair. I had worked under Nwosu for 4 years, and I was genuinely uncertain whether she slept. She had the kind of stillness that very competent people develop, the stillness of someone who has stopped spending energy on looking calm, because calm is simply the default state, the way a deep river looks slow from the surface. She was reading something on her personal tablet when I came in. She did not look up. Osei, good. Sit down and pull up the Vathi frequency range. Full spectrum. Not just the standard military bands. I sat. I pulled it up. And that is when I read the number out loud. 2.4 kilometers. On the main display, 17 glowing shapes held orbit above a planet that our charts called Carrion Reach. The planet itself was unremarkable from space, a dry brown world with 2 small moons, and the kind of thin atmosphere that suggested something had stripped it hard a long time ago. The shapes in orbit were not unremarkable. They were Vathi warships, 17 of them, each one between 400 and 900 meters long, each one carrying weapons systems that had ended the resistance of 3 separate civilizations in the past 6 decades. I knew about those civilizations. Everyone in the outer cluster knew about them. The Vathi hegemony made sure of it. The knowing was the point. The Vathi ships had been in standard patrol formation when we arrived. They were not in standard patrol formation anymore. They were reconfiguring. They've seen us, I said. Nwosu turned a page on her tablet. Yes. They're forming an encirclement pattern. Yes. Captain. She looked up, not with alarm. With the particular patience of someone who wants you to finish your sentence. They have 17 ships, I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked back at her tablet. I'm aware of the count, Osei. On my board, the Vathi frequency range was coming alive. Standard military bands first, the tight encrypted bursts that their fleet used for tactical coordination, but I was not listening to those. I was listening to the wider spectrum, the peripheral signals that military comms always bleed into the surrounding frequencies, no matter how encrypted the core channels are. You cannot run 17 warships in close formation without radio scatter. The scatter tells you things the encrypted channels never will. I was pulling the scatter apart signal by signal when the main hail came through. It came on every frequency simultaneously, which is the Vathi way of demonstrating that they do not need to aim. The translation engine rendered it in flat, neutral tones, but I knew enough Vathi to hear the original underneath, and the original did not sound flat or neutral. It sounded like something that had never been told no. It sounded like 600 years of yes. The gist was, identify yourself, state your intentions, and prepare to receive a boarding inspection team. Nwosu listened to the whole thing. She let it finish. She set down her tablet. Then she leaned back in her chair, covered her mouth with the back of her hand, and yawned. Not a performed yawn. Not a theatrical gesture for the benefit of the bridge crew. An actual, genuine, eyes-watering yawn of a woman who had been awake too long and whose body was registering the fact without her permission. She keyed the ship-wide comm. Battle stations. Let's keep it measured, people. Gunnery teams, you're cleared to your positions. Tell Kowalski he can finish his sandwich first. We've got about 12 minutes before they're in optimal range. She released the key. She picked up her tablet again. I stared at her for a moment. Then I stared at my board. Then I went back to pulling apart the radio scatter from 17 Vathi warships whose commanders were learning, in real time, that the new arrival had not responded to their hail with the speed and deference that every arrival in the history of this system had always shown. That was when I found the thing I was not expecting to find. Not military coordination, not tactical adjustments, not encrypted weapons data. A question. Repeated. Ship to ship, commander to commander, bleeding across the scatter in unencrypted fragments, because whoever was asking it had not thought to secure the channel, had not thought anyone outside the fleet could be listening, had not thought the question itself required secrecy, because it was not a tactical question. It was the kind of question you ask when something does not fit any category you have for it. What is it made of? I read it 3 times. I sat with it. Outside, through the forward viewport, the planet called Carrion Reach hung in its orbit, with no knowledge of, or interest in, what was happening above it, and 17 warships were completing their encirclement of one ship that had not moved, had not answered, had not shown any of the signs that a vessel in that position was supposed to show. What is it made of? I thought about that question for a long time. I thought about the materials engineers who had spent 9 years arguing about hull composite ratios in a building in Cape Town. I thought about the damage modeling teams in Helsinki who had run the same collision simulations 6,000 times, trying to find the point at which the numbers stopped being acceptable. I thought about the admiral who had signed off on the final design, and then gone home, and apparently not slept for 3 days, because she kept finding things she wanted to change, things that could be better, and her staff had eventually taken the design documents away from her, because at some point, you have to stop making it better and start making it real. I thought about all of that. And then I thought, they're asking the wrong question. The right question was not what the ship was made of. The right question was what the people inside it were made of. And that question, I was pretty sure, was going to take them a little longer to answer. On my board, the Vathi fleet finished its encirclement, 17 warships locked into position around one, their weapons systems powered up, each one registering on my sensors as a different color, and the display in front of me lit up like something that should have scared me considerably more than it did. Nuosu glanced at the display. She finished the page she was reading. "Osei," she said, "prepare a response to the hail. Standard contact protocol, Tier 1. And pull up the Keth Protectorate file while you're at it. We'll need it shortly." I opened the file. I prepared the response. Outside, the 17 warships waited. They were still waiting for us to flinch. They were going to wait a long time. The Vathi fired first. That was not a surprise. 6 centuries of uncontested authority will do that to a species. It teaches them that their presence is the warning, that their weapons are the period at the end of a sentence that does not require a sentence before it. They had surrounded us. We had not responded with appropriate urgency, and so they escalated in the way that everything always escalates when it has never learned to doubt itself. The first volley hit the forward starboard quarter of the unconquered sun. I felt it in my feet. That is the thing about being hit by a weapons discharge at that scale. You do not feel it in the way you feel small impacts, the way you feel a door slam or a vehicle brake hard. You feel it the way you feel a change in weather, something that moves through the whole structure of the world you are standing in, a deep shudder that travels up through the deck plating and through the soles of your boots and up through your legs and into your chest, and then the ship groans. Not a human sound, a structural sound. The sound of 2.4 kilometers of composite hull and internal framing and reinforced pressure compartments, registering an external force and deciding what to do about it. The ship decided to stay. My board lit up. I watched the numbers cascade, damage assessment unspooling in real time as every sensor array in the affected sectors reported back in sequence. Hull breach in Sector 9. Pressure drop in the adjoining corridor, already compensating. Heat signature on the outer hull plating, already dissipating. Structural integrity across the impacted sections reading at 91% and holding. Damage control came on the channel before I had finished reading it. Chief Engineer Priya Subramaniam, her voice carrying the specific calm of someone who loved the thing she was responsible for, and was therefore not going to panic about it receiving cosmetic damage. "She's annoyed," Priya said, "but she's fine." I have thought about that sentence many times since. She's annoyed, but she's fine. In another context, it would be the kind of thing you say about a person who has been mildly inconvenienced. In this context, it was an engineering assessment. In Priya's register, those two things were not meaningfully different. I did not have long to think about it because the Vathi fired again. The second volley hit amidships, lower deck, and this one I felt in my teeth. The display went a different set of colors. The numbers cascaded again. Structural integrity in the secondary hull. Exterior ablative layers doing exactly what they had been designed to do, which was absorb the energy of impacts and distribute it laterally across the hull surface rather than letting it concentrate and penetrate. 9 years of arguments about composite ratios in Cape Town. The numbers held. On the tactical display, the 17 Vathi warships maintained their positions. I watched their weapons systems on my board. Charged. Ready. And then, for a beat that lasted exactly 4 seconds, nothing. That pause. I had read everything I could find about Vathi military doctrine before this deployment, which was not a great deal, because most of what we knew about them was what they had chosen to let leak into the intelligence channels of the civilizations they had dealings with, and what they chose to let leak was carefully curated to produce a particular effect. But even in curated intelligence there are behavioral patterns, and the behavioral pattern I had noticed in every recorded Vathi military engagement was this. After a second volley that produced no visible capitulation response from the target capitulated. Not because the second volley was necessarily decisive, because the second volley represented the final clarity of intent, the removal of all ambiguity, the moment at which a reasonable opponent understood that there would be no softening, and no limit, and no ceiling, and the reasonable thing was to accept that, and behave accordingly. Every species the Vathi had ever fought had been reasonable about it. We were on the bridge of a ship that had just absorbed 2 weapons discharges and was reading at 91% structural integrity, and Captain Adeyeze Nwosu was using the 4-second pause to finish reading the paragraph she was on. She set the tablet down. She looked at the tactical display with the mild attentiveness of someone reading a bill they expected to be higher than it was. "Priya," she said, keying the engineering channel. "How are the hull seals looking on Sector 9? Priya's voice came back with the faint background sound of people moving purposefully. Sealed and pressure normalized. The ablative layer on the starboard forward quarter took about 30% degradation from the first hit. Still inside tolerance. Good. Keep me posted." She released the key. She looked at me. "They're waiting," I said. "They are. For us to do something." "Yes." I looked at my board. The Vathi fleet was still holding formation. Their weapons were still charged. The 4-second pause was becoming a 10-second pause, becoming 20, becoming a full minute of 17 warships, an encirclement of one ship that had been hit twice, and had not moved, and had not responded, and had not shown any of the behavioral markers that Vathi military intelligence apparently used to track the progress of an opponent's will to resist. The markers presumably included things like returning fire, attempting to flee, hailing with a capitulation message, venting atmosphere, showing power fluctuations consistent with internal damage cascades. We were not doing any of those things. I was watching the scatter frequencies. The question had been repeating since before the first volley, and it was still repeating now, and it had been joined by others, fragments of communication bleeding across the wide channels, and I was translating them as fast as my working knowledge of Vathi would let me, which was imperfect but sufficient. What are they waiting for? Have they sent a distress signal? Are they attempting repairs? And then one that I sat with for longer than the others. Why have they not responded to damage? That one came from a ship near the edge of the formation, commander to crew from the signal signature, and the part that stayed with me was not the question but the tone underneath it. I could not have explained in precise terms how I was reading tone in a language I spoke at 60% proficiency. But tone is not entirely linguistic. Tone is pattern. Tone is the speed of transmission and the frequency of repetition and the length of the gap before the next message. The tone underneath that question was not tactical concern. It was the early shape of something else. The Vathi Supreme Commander finally opened a direct channel to us. He addressed himself to the ship in general, rather than to any named individual, which told me he still did not know who he was talking to, had not yet conceptualized the unconquered sun as a vessel with a specific command structure and a specific person at the top of it. To him, we were still a thing. An object, an obstacle with unclear parameters. The translation engine rendered his words in the same flat, neutral tone it used for everything, but I had enough Vathi to hear the original, and the original was doing something very specific with its cadence that the translation lost. It was asking, but asking in the register that does not acknowledge the possibility of a particular answer. The register of a species that has asked questions for 600 years and received, at the end of every question, the answer it expected. The question was, state the nature of your vessel and your purpose in this system. Nwosu listened to it finish. She keyed the response channel. This is Captain Adayeze Nwosu, of the GES Unconquered Sun, Earth Expeditionary Service. We're here to have a conversation about the Keth Protectorate. If you're done with the weapons demonstration, I'd appreciate it if we could get to that. She released the key. She looked at me. Get the Keth file open and formatted for transmission. Clean version, no appendices. And Osei, keep watching the scatter frequencies. Yes, Captain. I kept watching. What came back across the scatter in the next 3 minutes was the kind of thing that intelligence analysts spend careers hoping to intercept, and almost never do, because it was not a tactical communication at all. It was 17 senior Vathi commanders trying to process something that did not fit into any category they had, and the processing was happening across channels they had not secured because the possibility of an outside listener had not occurred to them. They had been the most powerful military force in this region of space for 600 years. The possibility of someone being outside, watching, and understanding what they said to each other was not a risk they had ever needed to consider. I translated as fast as I could. Fragments, pieces, the shape of something. It has not attempted to flee. It has not attempted to return fire. It sustained 2 direct hits, and its power signature has not changed. Its power signature has not changed. That last one was the one that circulated the longest. Ship to ship, commander to commander. The same observation passed around a circle of 17 warships, and it was not anger in the transmission. It was not tactical concern. It was the specific frequency of a question that a very confident species is asking for the first time, because it has never needed to ask it before. What do we do when it does not break? I wrote it down exactly as I translated it. I put it in my log with a timestamp. I did not show it to Nwosu then, because she had her eyes on the tactical display, and the conversation with the Vathi Supreme Commander was still going in the specific direction she had been steering it, which was away from the subject of us, and toward the subject of the Keth Protectorate, and she was doing it the way she did everything, which was quietly, persistently, without apparent effort, the way water moves toward the lowest point. I looked out the forward viewport at the stars. I thought about a question that 17 warships were asking each other in a circle. What do we do when it does not break? We don't, I thought. That's the answer. We don't break. We keep going. We have always kept going. We are constitutionally, structurally, pathologically incapable of the alternative, not because we're fearless, not because we're powerful, but because somewhere in the long, difficult history of our species, we learned that the thing that is trying to break you is not as permanent as your refusal to let it. I put that in my log too. Then I went back to listening. The Vathi Supreme Commander opened a channel to Nwosu directly. His identifier resolved to the name Veth Alakar, which the translator rendered phonetically because there was no human equivalent, and his title translated to something the engine rendered as, He Who Has Not Been Refused, which I thought was probably not perfectly accurate, but captured the spirit of it. Nwosu answered with her name and rank, no title, nothing that would suggest she felt any need to match the weight of his, which was its own statement whether she intended it that way or not. The conversation that followed was not a confrontation, it was a briefing. Nwosu briefed the Supreme Commander of the Vathi hegemony on the situation in the Keth Protectorate, with the patient thoroughness of a woman presenting facts to someone who has not yet decided to accept them, but who will eventually, because facts do not require acceptance to remain facts. The Vathi hegemony had been operating in Keth space for 4 decades. The Keth were a smaller species, less technically advanced, with no military force capable of resisting the hegemony's presence in any meaningful way. The arrangement was not called occupation. It was called a resource partnership. The distinction was maintained with great care in official Vathi communications. Earth had been watching the Keth Protectorate for 11 years, not intervening, watching, building a file, learning the language, learning the geography, learning the names. Nuosu laid this out clearly and without emphasis, because the thing about facts is that they do not require emphasis. Emphasis is for persuasion. Facts just need to be stated correctly. Vethalakar listened. He was good at listening. 6 centuries of governance will do that. Then he responded with the thing that every entity responds with, when the facts they are being given are inconvenient. He responded with power, not argument, not rebuttal. Power, his fleet, his history, his 600 years of authority in this region of space, his long reach, his certainty. Nuosu let him finish. She had this quality of letting people finish that was more disarming than interruption, because it gave them nothing to push against. Then she said, "I understand. Let me tell you what I'm concerned about with that position." She pulled up the Unconquered Sun's weapons manifest on the shared channel. Not as a threat. The way she framed it, it was not a threat. It was a technical document. She walked him through it the way a contractor walks a client through load specifications, item by item, with the calm interest of someone who finds the subject genuinely engaging and thinks the other person might too, if they give it a moment. It took 9 minutes. By the end of it, Vethalakar had not said anything. The silence had a different texture than the earlier silences. The earlier silences were the silence of someone deciding how to respond. This one was the silence of someone doing arithmetic. Then he asked his question. Why does a single vessel require this many methods of applying force? Nuosu paused. A real pause, not a performance. The pause of someone who has been asked a question they find genuinely interesting and is deciding how to answer it honestly. Because we've always had to fight things bigger than us, she said. We got good at it. Another silence. What things? Vethalakar said. What things that were larger than you? Nuosu did not answer immediately. I watched her face. The expression there was not calculation. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like the look you get when someone asks you about a hard thing from a long time ago. Not painful exactly, but dense, with weight and age and complicated layers you would need more time to unpack than the conversation allows. Each other, mostly, she said. For a very long time. Silence. I was watching my scatter feeds, and also watching Nuosu, and also watching the tactical display, all 3 at once, the way bridge work trains you to process multiple streams simultaneously, without prioritizing any of them, until something changes. Something changed. On the tactical display, the Vathi formation shifted. Not into a tighter attack pattern, the opposite. A withdrawal angle. The specific configuration that Vathi fleet doctrine used when extracting from an engagement zone, ships rotating to present optimal acceleration profiles for departure, weapons systems beginning to power down from full charge to standby. After 2 volleys. After 17 ships surrounding 1. After all of that, they were calculating the cost of continued engagement and finding the number unacceptable. I sent Nuosu a text to her personal console, 3 words. They're repositioning, withdrawing. She read it. She did not look up. She did not change her expression. She went back to the conversation with Vethalakar, seamlessly, as though the tactical display did not exist. They talked for another 40 minutes. At the end of it, the Vathi fleet held position. Not withdrawing yet. Not attacking. The middle place. The place of people who are deciding something. I went back to my scatter feeds. What I found there I kept to myself for a long time. It was a transmission from a younger commander, not Vethalakar, someone near the outer edge of the formation. The channel was not encrypted. I was not sure it was meant to be private. It might have been meant to be heard. He was speaking to his crew, not his command staff, his crew. And what he said, translated imperfectly into English, through a program built by linguists in Nairobi, on unpaid evenings, was approximately this. They are not afraid of us. I have been watching them since they arrived, and they are not afraid of us. I do not think they have the mechanism for it. I think they are afraid of something. I think it is something that makes our fleet look like very little. I think they have been at war with it for a very long time, and it made them into what they are. I do not think we have a word for what they fight for. That is the thing that is sitting in my chest right now. We do not have a word for it. I read it 4 times. I did not put it in my official report. Some things do not belong in official reports. Some things belong in the place where you keep the things that change the shape of how you understand the universe. And you take them out sometimes when you need to remember why you are doing this work, and then you put them carefully back. I put it back. Outside, Carrion Reach held its orbit. The Vathi fleet held its position. The unconquered sun held everything. The Keth ship did not announce itself. There was no hail, no signal burst, no formal request for communication. It simply appeared on my sensors, moving toward us from the far side of Carrion Reach's second moon, and the first thing I registered about it was the speed, which was not impressive, and the second thing I registered was the size, which was very small, and the third thing, which took me a moment longer because my sensors had to look twice to make sense of it, was the composite reading on its hull. 40-year-old materials, not 40-year-old design, not a 40-year-old ship class. The actual physical components of the vessel were 4 decades old, and they had been repaired and re-repaired, and in several places replaced with components that did not originally belong to that kind of ship, grafted in with the specific pragmatic inventiveness of people who could not get new parts, and therefore made old parts work in ways their manufacturers had not intended. Chief Engineer Priya Subramaniam appeared on my console. Not on the bridge, she was still in engineering, but she had the same sensor feeds I had, and she had clearly been watching. "Oh say," she said, and her voice had the quality it got when she was looking at something that had earned her respect, in the specific language that engineering earns respect, which is not admiration exactly, more like recognition, the recognition of difficulty survived.
"Have you looked at the drive signature on that thing?"
I'm looking at it now. That is a modified Karath series secondary drive, being used as the primary propulsion system. You know what a Karath series secondary drive was designed to do? No. Provide low-power maneuvering in dock, not propulsion, maneuvering in dock. Someone has taken a docking thruster and made it carry an entire ship through deep space. A pause. I want to know who did that. I wanted to know who did that too. The Keth ship entered our sensor range fully, and I got a complete picture of it. It was about 60 meters from bow to stern, which made it roughly the size of one of the unconquered sun's support tenders, and it was holding together with what my structural sensors diplomatically described as improvised integrity reinforcement, which meant they had welded things to the outside of it to keep the inside from becoming the outside. It was the most determined-looking object I had ever seen. On the bridge, Nuosu was watching the same feeds. She had put her tablet down. The Keth ship came to a stop approximately 300 meters from our forward hull. Not alongside, not directly ahead, slightly to one side, the way you stop when you are approaching something enormous, and you want to make sure it has room to see you, but you are not placing yourself directly in front of it. Considerate, or possibly terrified. Hard to tell from positioning alone. I opened the contact channel and sat with my hands over the translation system, and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. The Keth language had been in Earth's database for 11 years. Built from intercepted signals, from distress calls that had leaked out of the protectorate and into the surrounding space over 4 decades, assembled by a linguistics team in Nairobi, who had worked on it in the hours after their regular shifts, because someone had decided it needed to be done, and there was no budget for it, and they had done it anyway. The resulting translation program covered approximately 60% of common Keth vocabulary, and considerably less of Keth grammar, which is not a clean language. It is a language that has absorbed pieces of several other languages over a long history of contact and conflict, and is therefore full of irregularities that even its own speakers sometimes disagree about. 60%. Enough to function, not enough to be certain. The hail came through on a frequency that told me immediately the Keth had been listening to our signals since before they came around the moon. They had found our contact channel by monitoring our communications. They had not known which frequency to use, and they had reverse-engineered it. From a ship held together with welded reinforcement and a docking thruster. I opened the channel. The voice that came through was not what I expected. I had not examined what I expected, but afterward I thought about it and realized I had been expecting something that sounded like a distress call, something thin and urgent and cracked at the edges with long duration of distress. What I heard instead was a voice that had made a specific decision about how to present itself and was holding to that decision with enormous discipline. Steady, that was the word. The voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they have decided to be, not because the steadiness is natural, but because the alternative is not acceptable. The translation engine processed the words and gave me back a 60% approximation. Are you real? 2 words, in the English rendering. 3 words, in the original. The extra syllable, carrying something the translation dropped. Something closer to, are you actually, truly, in the physical world, present? I looked at Nuosu. She was watching me. She had heard it too. I knew she was going to reach for the formal response protocol, the Tier 1 contact script, because that was the procedure, and Nuosu believed in procedure. I knew that was the correct thing. I knew the correct thing. My hands were already on the channel key. I opened it. Yeah, I said. We're real. Not in the script. Not procedure. 3 words in English that the translation engine would render into Keth as something approximately meaning, affirmative. You are in contact with a physical presence. The pause on the other end lasted long enough that I thought I had made a mistake. Then, a sound. Not words. A sound that the translation engine flagged as non-linguistic, meaning it did not map to any vocabulary, meaning it was something the Keth commander had made, without intending to make language, something that came from a place below language. I have described it since, to people who were not there, as a sound like someone sitting down for the first time after a very long walk. That is the closest I can get in English. Something between relief and exhaustion and something else that does not have a precise name in any language I know. The specific feeling of having held something up for so long that when you are finally allowed to put it down, the putting down itself takes a moment to believe. The Keth commander composed himself. I could hear it happening, the steady voice returning. We sent signals, he said, through the translator. For many years, we did not know if they reached anyone. They reached us, I said. 11 years ago, we've been listening since then. Another pause. 11 years, he said. Yes. You came after 11 years. The way he said it, not accusation. Not gratitude, not exactly. Something more complicated than either. The tone of someone who has been solving an arithmetic problem for a very long time, and has finally been given a number, and is processing what that number means, about the time that passed before it. We came as soon as we could get here, I said, and then, because the 60% translation was not sufficient for what I wanted to say, and I was going to have to trust the approximation, we're sorry it took this long. The translation engine rendered it. I watched the waveform on my screen that showed when the transmission reached the other ship. Silence. Long enough that I counted it. Then the Keth commander asked if he could see us. I understood the question. Not our faces. Not our bodies. The ship. He wanted to see the ship. I patched through the external camera feeds and rotated the view, slowly, so the Keth ship's sensors could capture the full profile of the unconquered sun. 2.4 kilometers of matte dark hull, scarred now on the forward starboard quarter where the first Vathi volley had impacted, the wound sealed but visible, the ablative layer still showing the thermal discoloration of a hit absorbed. Massive in the way that things are massive when you are in space, and you have no scale reference to diminish them against. The Keth commander was quiet for a long time. Then, through the imperfect translator, rendered in approximate English by a program built on unpaid evenings in Nairobi, we told our children you would come. We did not believe it ourselves. My throat did something I did not document in my official report. I put both hands on my console, and I sat with what he had said, and I thought about 11 years. I thought about the linguists. I thought about the distress signals that had leaked out of this system for 4 decades. Thin signals, imperfect signals, signals that had crossed the distance between carrion reach and the nearest relay point, and arrived fragmented and weak and hard to interpret. And someone had heard them, and had thought, those are people. That is a people asking if anyone can hear them. And someone else had said, write the translator, build the file, learn the language, not because there was a plan to come here yet, just because someone had to. because they were asking, because leaving them to ask without at least learning to understand them was a specific kind of abandonment that certain people find they are not capable of. We told our children you would come. That sentence. That is the one I have read more times than I can count, in the years since, in the log where I keep the things that changed the shape of how I understand the universe. They were telling their children about us before we had any plan to come here, before Earth had made any commitment, before there was any mission, before the unconquered sun existed as anything more than a design argument in Cape Town. The Keth were telling their children that someone out there had heard them and would come. In my log, next to that sentence, I have written, "We cannot be late again." Not because I think we will be, because I need to remember that once, we almost were. The Keth commander asked what would happen to the Vathi fleet. I told him that was for the captain to address. I transferred him to Nuosu. I did not listen to that conversation. I sat at my console and watched my scatter feeds and thought about what it meant to be the first human voice a Keth person had ever heard, and whether I had said the right things, and whether it mattered what I had said as long as I had said something real. Yeah, we're real. I could not have done the script, not at that moment, not to that voice. The Keth ship held its position 300 meters off our forward hull. 60 meters of improvised endurance, 40-year-old components, welded reinforcement, and a docking thruster doing the work of a main drive. Priya told me later that she had run the calculations on that drive configuration during the lull in communications and had come up with a range figure that she described as genuinely extraordinary, given the power-to-mass ratio involved, and that whoever had made those modifications had a grasp of the relevant engineering principles that she found she had significant respect for. She also said she wanted to buy that person coffee. I think she meant it. The Vathi fleet held its orbit. The encirclement had not dissolved, but it had relaxed, which in Vathi fleet behavior meant that the threat of immediate action was diminishing. Vethalakar had not transmitted anything on the main channel in 40 minutes. The scatter frequencies were quieter than they had been, which meant either the interfleet communications had moved to properly secured channels, or the commanders had run out of questions. I did not think they had run out of questions. I thought they were sitting with the questions the same way I had been sitting with them, the same way everyone sits with things that are true and large and do not fit into the categories you had before you encountered them. Nuosu finished her conversation with the Keth commander. She sat for a moment looking at the viewport, the planet below, the Keth ship ahead, the dark of space around everything, the same dark that has always been around everything regardless of what happens inside it. She looked at me. "Osei," she said. "Yes. Good work on the scatter intercepts. Write it up clean." "Yes, Captain." She turned back to the display. "Tactical, engineering, fleet positions, all of it." She looked, for a moment, exactly like what she was. A person who had done a thing that needed doing, and was now doing the next thing that needed doing, and the thing after that, and the thing after that, because the work does not stop at the moment that feels like a conclusion. The work especially does not stop at the moment that feels like a conclusion. Kowalski came onto the bridge with half a sandwich that I was fairly certain had been in his pocket for 3 hours. He sat at his station and ate it with the peaceful expression of a man whose immediate problem had been resolved. Priya sent me an engineering update from below. Hull integrity stable across all sectors. The Sector 9 seal was holding. The ablative layer on the forward starboard quarter was showing the hit, but was still within operational parameters. The ship was fine. She's annoyed, but she's fine. Outside, 17 warships orbited the same planet as one. Between them and us, a 60-meter ship with a docking thruster for a main drive waited for the answer to a question that had been asked for 40 years. What happens next? I started writing my report. The Vathi fleet withdrew on the 4th day. Not the way things withdraw in stories, not with drama, not with a final moment of confrontation that clarified the terms of the retreat, not with any gesture toward acknowledgement of what had changed. They withdrew the way empires often do when they are not yet ready to call it withdrawing. They repositioned, extended, spread to a wider orbit that happened, ship by ship over the course of about 6 hours, to increase their average distance from Carrion Reach, and from us, until they were no longer in any meaningful sense surrounding us, and then they continued increasing that distance, until they were at the edge of the system, and then they left. I was on shift when the last of them cleared the outer sensor perimeter. I noted it in the log. I told the captain. She said, "Good." She meant it the way you mean good when you are already thinking about what comes next. What came next was 14 days of the most complicated work I have ever been part of. The diplomatic team was 3 weeks behind us, in transit, which meant that the gap between the Vathi departure and their arrival had to be covered by us, and covering it meant Nuosu had to simultaneously maintain contact with Vethalakar's fleet at long range to ensure the withdrawal held, maintain regular contact with the Keth command to establish the framework for what followed, and keep the unconquered sun in a state of readiness that communicated without saying it that a departure was not the same as an absence of consequence. I slept 4 hours at a time, and ate when someone reminded me that I was supposed to, and watched my boards with the focused attention of someone who knows that the thing they are watching matters and is therefore not willing to look away. On the 3rd day after the Vathi withdrawal, 3 more Keth ships came around the second moon. Not 1. 3. In formation, insofar as their varied sizes and states of repair allowed formation, which was approximately. They were different sizes, different configurations, clearly not built at the same time or in the same place, carrying the evidence of their years in the specific way that things carry evidence of their years when their years have been hard. They came to join the first ship. No hail, they just came. I watched them take up positions near the first Keth vessel, and I thought about what that meant, what it takes to bring a ship like those ships through space to an uncertain situation because your one colleague who had gone first had sent back a message that said, "The people are real, and they are here." And these people had climbed into their improbable ships and made the transit and positioned themselves near us in the specific way that people stand together when they are no longer sure they have to stand alone. I opened a channel to all 4 Keth vessels. "This is Yara Osei, of the GES Unconquered Sun," I said. "We're glad you're here." The translation engine rendered it. I waited. The first commander, the steady voice, came back. "We are. Also," he said, and then, "There are more coming." I relayed that to Nuosu. She looked at the tactical display for a moment. Then she said, "Good. The more the better." I started keeping a second log. Not the official one. A personal one. The kind that does not get filed anywhere. The kind you keep because some things need a place to exist that is not a report. I wrote in it every day during those 14 days, sometimes at length and sometimes just a sentence or two, usually whatever was in my head at the moment I sat down with it. On day 5 I wrote, "Priya has adopted the Keth chief engineer as a professional contact. They have been exchanging technical documents through our translation relay for 2 days. She showed me one of his schematics this morning and said, and I am quoting directly, that the approach was outside the standard framework, but internally consistent in a way that suggested someone who had arrived at the relevant principles independently, and then extended them in directions the standard framework had not considered. She said this with the tone she uses when she is describing something she admires. On day 7 I wrote, "The Keth commander's name is something the translator renders as approximately Reth. I have asked him twice, gently, whether there is a version of it that works better in English, and both times he has said that Reth is fine. I do not think Reth is actually fine as a rendering of what his name sounds like, but I think he is being pragmatic about it, and I respect that." On day 9 I wrote, "There are 11 Keth ships near us now. I have been watching them during my off hours when I should be sleeping. They are all different. Different sizes, different configurations, different states of repair. The one thing they share is that they are here, and they are whole, and they made it here under their own power. I think about what that means. I think about what it costs to keep a ship running for 40 years when you cannot get the parts you need. I think about the engineering, and I think about the decision-making, and I think about the morning when someone woke up and decided to come here. To make the transit to the location where a very large unfamiliar ship was in an uncertain standoff with the fleet that had been their problem for 4 decades, and to point their improvised ship in that direction and go. I could not sleep after I wrote that. I lay in my bunk and looked at the ceiling and thought about it until my next shift. On day 11, Veth-Alakar sent a final message. It came through the formal diplomatic channel, addressed to Nuosu, and I was the one who translated it and delivered it to her. She read it standing in the corridor outside the bridge, which is where she sometimes went when she needed 30 seconds of a space that was not the bridge. I stood there while she read it. She read it twice. She handed the tablet back to me. She went back onto the bridge without saying anything. I stood in the corridor and read it again. He wrote that he had governed for 600 years. He wrote that he had seen rebellions and wars and the end of species. He wrote that he had never in that time seen a people who fought the way we fought, not for territory, not for dominance, not because the alternative was destruction. He wrote that he did not have a word for what we fought for. He wrote that this was more disturbing to him than our weapons systems. I read it a third time. Then I kept it. I have not shown it to many people. It is in my personal log, not the official one. I take it out sometimes when I need to remember what this was actually about, when the paperwork and the transit schedules and the diplomatic coordination get heavy enough that the center of the thing starts to feel far away. I know what we fight for. We fight for the voice on the other end of the channel, the steady voice that has been steady for a long time, not because steadiness is easy, but because the alternative is not acceptable. We fight for the 11 ships around the second moon, with their improvised engines and their 40-year-old hulls. We fight for the child who was told, "Someone heard us. Someone is coming." We fight because we told that child something was true, and we are not the kind of people who can live with having said something true and then let it become untrue. We don't have a clean word for that either, in English. The closest we have is stubborn, or spite, or love, when we're feeling honest. On day 13, I was finishing my personal log for the day, when the new signal came through on the deep array. I almost missed it, because I was writing, and my attention was divided. Then the system flagged it, and I read the origin point, and I put the log down. Fold space signature. Not ours. Not Vathi. Another Earth ship dropping out of transit at the edge of the system. Then a second. Then a pause of about 4 minutes. And then 4 more. Close together. Coming out of the same transit corridor. 6 ships. Earth Expeditionary Service registration codes. Resolving one by one on my sensor board. The diplomatic team was still a week away. These were not the diplomatic team. These were... I sat back in my chair. I thought about Cape Town, about Helsinki, about the admiral who couldn't sleep because she kept finding things to improve, about the timeline, the launch schedules, the logistics of sending a ship to a system this far out and then sending more ships behind it before you know what the first one found, on the assumption that one ship might not be enough, and it is better to already have more on the way than to find out you need more and then wait for them. You plan for the possibility that one ship is not enough. You plan for the possibility that one voice is not enough. You send more. You always send more. The Keth ships around the second moon had detected the new arrivals. I could see on my boards that they were adjusting orientation, the small recalibrations of vessels pointing their sensor arrays at a new thing, updating their picture of the situation. I opened the channel to Reth. "Those are ours," I said. The translator rendered it. I waited. "More," he said. "More." A pause. "How many more?" he said. I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the ships behind those 6 ships, in transit, in preparation, in the early stages of planning. I thought about what the arrival of 6 ships meant about the calculation that had been running in Earth's command structure since the unconquered sun's last check-in. "More than you need," I said. "Fewer than we would have sent if we'd known sooner." The translation engine approximated it. I waited. The sound from the Keth commander this time was quieter than the one on that first day. Not a sitting-down sound. Something more like the sound of a long exhale, long enough that you start to understand how long the breath had been held. I went back to my personal log. I read what I had written across 14 days. I read about Priya and the schematics and the steady voice and the 11 ships and the admiral who couldn't sleep. I read Vethalakar's message again, the part about not having a word for what we fight for. I found the Keth file on my console, the original database, and I went looking for something I had seen referenced in a footnote weeks ago, something a linguist in Nairobi had flagged and marked as culturally significant, no known translation equivalent, too old and too specific to map cleanly onto any human concept. I found it. The word was very old, older than the Vathi's 6 centuries by a significant margin. It had been in the Keth language since before they had ships, since they were still on their home planet looking up at the stars and doing what every species does in that position. which is wonder and hope and build stories around both. The linguist's note said, "This word appears in contexts of anticipation and of arrival simultaneously, used for the moment when something hoped for becomes real. No precise English equivalent. Closest approximation would require a phrase rather than a single word." She had written the approximate phrase below the note. I read it. Then I wrote it in my log. The ones we hoped would come. I looked at it for a long time. Then I opened my official report, found the last section, and I typed it in. Not everything belongs in the personal log. Not everything belongs in the space where you keep the things too large and too true for official language. Some things belong in the record. Some things need to be on file, dated, and time-stamped and archived where anyone can find them, because the people who come after this need to know what this was called by the people who were there when it was happening. Not a victory, not a mission completed, not a tactical success. The ones we hoped would come. I finished the report. Outside, the Keth ships held their positions near ours, and the 6 new Earth ships were closing the distance across the system, and the planet below held its orbit the way planets do, with complete indifference to what the people above it are building in the spaces between themselves. Carrion Reach. We were going to have to do something about that name. The Keth had their own name for it. I had found it in the database, buried in an old signal fragment, and the translation was imperfect, but the linguist had taken a guess at it. Something like, the world where we began to wait. I put that in the report too. Nwosu, reading the final draft, stopped at that line and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Keep it." She signed off on the report. She went back to the viewport and stood there looking out at the stars, the way she sometimes stood when she thought no one was watching, with the expression that was not victory and not relief but something older and quieter, the expression of someone who has done a thing that needed doing and has felt the full weight of it. I watched her for a moment, then I looked back at my boards. My boards were quiet. The threat channels were empty. The scatter frequencies were running normal background noise, the ambient radiation of space, meaningless and constant and indifferent. Outside, in the space above a planet called the world where we began to wait, a collection of ships that had never been in the same orbit before held their positions. Earth ships, Keth ships, the specific mix of them, the ones who came, the ones who had been waiting, the same sky. Finally,